Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. President Yoon Suk-yeol surprised the world by declaring martial law on TV on December 3rd. Since then, the political developments in Seoul have been more dramatic than Korean TV shows. To help us understand this, we're speaking to Jiyoung Ri-bom from Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Jiyoung.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Wenqi.
So what is happening in South Korea these days? So from attempted martial law to presidential impeachment, attempted suicide of imprisoned defense minister to President Yoon's refusal to step down. Can it be more dramatic?
Well, I think before I answer that question, as the political crisis unfolds, I think we need to ask sort of why now, right? Why this moment, this martial law declaration and the quick reversal by the National Assembly. So, I think in some sense, as in many presidential democracies, with a divided government, right? The President Yoon's, his ruling party, PPP, the People's Power Party, faced just an insurmountable situation, right? That just got worse and worse throughout his first half of his administration. But at the nature of
He's been
divided
called like a lame duck president, basically.
lame duck president who, in a single 5-year term, and we'll see if he gets to complete it, but it's very difficult to govern, right? So, and as just to contextualize the situation, he came to power in 2022 with a razor thin, right, majority margin, less than 1%. And on top of that, in the recent April elections, the general elections, the liberal opposition, the Democratic Party or the DP, not only maintained their majority, but expanded it, right? Leaving them in control of like some 192 out of 300 seats. And on top of that, this was in 32 years, the highest voter turnout in South Korea. So there was a very, strong popular mandate, right? So I think that's an important context to understand why now, because the sort of left center party has over time through Korea's 4 decades of democracy have grown in strength, in power as a main competitor, right, to the ruling conservative.
Right. So, but still didn't explain why now and why using martial law as the tool, because it's pretty serious, right? Especially looking at South Korea's history.
Yes.
It is a taboo almost. It's not, something that people seem to want to welcome.
That's right. And I think that that's a very important thing to raise because, of course, as you said, most Koreans were in complete shock, right?
Yeah. The
Some
whole
thought it
world was in
whole
complete
world
shock.
and complete shock. And first, people thought it was fake news, right?
Mm.
Until things started to settle. But it's a very kind of sort of painful reminder of its authoritarian
Yes.
path and crackdowns on the public during its sort of, economic development period, right? So in fact, for example, the Gwangju Uprising was a series of student-led demonstrations that took
Right.
place in May of 1980. In fact, today marks the coup of December 12th in 1979 under Jun. So I think Yoon, why now and why not other places with divided government and presidential systems? Korea has a very strong presidential system constitutionally,
Mm.
and its sort of political partisanship, competition is sort of left over from the end of the Korean War and the Cold War era, right? Where both parties on both sides of the spectrum have, yes, some ideological positions and some key salient issues, but also sort of have the sort of identity, right, with the politics that ended at the end of the Cold War and prior. So Yoon's sort of act, right, is not only a reminder of kind of the strongman era, certainly his rhetoric, including in his declaration, spoke of kind of the so-called opposition anti, right, state forces is a
Right.
kind of a reminder of some of the language and perhaps quote unquote justification in his mind.
Is he actually a strong man in that sense? Because also to justify his declaration of martial law, he actually said, there's some infiltration almost by North Koreans. I mean, it just sounded so um, almost like I don't know what the other word is to describe the situation other than drama. I mean, he must have felt so threatened that he had to do this. I guess, one question is like, why couldn't he just continue
Mm,
to
mm,
govern even though he's lame duck?
yeah, yeah.
What was the threat to him
Yeah.
that he had to do this?
Yeah. Well, very good question, and we're discovering more and more developments. In fact, today, just recently, he came out very much in defense of his decree and justified it by saying this was out of, a threat to my government being
Right.
able to do the things that my people voted me to do. So I think again back to how did it sort of escalate to this? We'll never know why he chose to go this route perfectly, but on the other hand, from kind of looking at the institutional tension that got sort of more intense over time, some things just to highlight is, the National Assembly continued to resist and block his sort of agenda, right? Things
Mhm.
like his efforts to cut corporate taxes, overhauling pension system, and addressing things like housing prices. So in the face of more labor unrest, right, including
Mhm.
now the year-long doctor strike. So not, and on top of that, there was more and more resistance about his appointments, including the prosecutor's office and judiciary. So he was vetoing lots of bills, right, that the National Assembly had passed. So from a governing standpoint, this is something
Mhm.
that just inherently between the executive and legislature became worse over time. So
Mhm.
much so that I think also the other telling thing was the sort of criminal accusations against his wife.
Life,
Uh,
yeah. So what was going on over there? Like, was there some corruption or something that's being discovered?
well, there are accusations of some corruption. There are a couple of issues that I think, you know, he was trying to, he was, so in other words, the opposition accused him being hypocritical because, why can we not continue to investigate this on charges, but we can with others in the opposition party, for example, his impeachment probe. Again, the main special prosecution office, it's under the president, right? I mean, they're supposed to be
Mhm.
independent, but they're very much very
Part of
powerful
the president.
president.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think the other thing that's really noteworthy is, and a lot of our audience probably knows this, is that even before the martial law decree, his popular approval rating was very
Very
low,
low.
between
Yep.
28 to 30%.
Yep.
Just last month, it was 19%. So maybe it was out of sort of his last ditch effort to hang on to power and
Yeah.
maintain some form of, his ability to govern.
I mean, it's interesting how much, trying to stay alive in politics would motivate someone to do. What was really interesting also was that the US said it was deeply surprised by Yoon's move. And it actually came from Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell, a very high level. So what does that mean for US-Korea relation?
Well, as you said, the US was very taken aback, very concerned. Initially, I think they sort of wanted to, as they should, let the domestic politics play out. But I think because South Korea hosts, 20 biggest military, right, base outside the United States, I think they were pretty relieved when it quickly reversed, right? And he did, in fact, lift the vote, the legislative block of his decree. So, yes, I think interestingly, the alliance is intact over principles of democracy and rule of law, etc. But it couldn't have come at a more delicate and time wise, because as we see the sort of looming right transition of President-elect Trump and their administration. So from the U.S. side, right, the Biden administration probably wants to lock in as many policies before leaving, including some of the very, I think, almost legacy level kinds of alliances between Japan, Korea, and the United States, for example. And so I think, but on the South Korean perspective, they're losing precious time, right? That could otherwise be building conversation and sort of going into the Trump administration with their team.
Were they, I mean, I would assume they would expect even, I don't know, sort of, potentially even more support from the Trump administration, despite that, Trump in the past has said things like, they wanted Koreans to pay for the U.S. military, being stationed there. However, we know that, Trump actually, pays a lot of attention to the Korean Peninsula. And so, does that also mean that, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into that, but does President Yoon also feel like with the transition into the Trump administration, that may not be as helpful to him?
Well, I can't answer that directly, and certainly I think how the either resignation or impeachment plays out in the coming weeks and months will even be a relevant question for him, right? But assuming that his party or the prime minister who will be acting if this moves forward, impeachment vote and so on, yeah, from I think the ruling party standpoint, again, I can't answer for sure because the party is not unified. As you know, there's a pro-Yoon faction.
Yes, there's a divide as well.
Right, which is definitely affecting what's unfolding. So I think yes and no, it's more likely than, let's say, if Lee Jae-myung from the opposition comes into power, let's say after a snap election, okay? From a foreign policy standpoint, we'll likely see on that sort of under that administration more re-engagement with North Korea, maybe more pro-China, right? Hostility and shakeup.
So do you think North Korea is exploiting or will exploit this political crisis? I mean, right now, South Korea seems like nobody knows who's in charge. I mean, if I were North Korea, this is like a perfect time to do something, but they seem to be also not, or not yet.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, I think history reminds us that certainly this could be an opportunity, but it's a different time, right? Even from administration to administration, North Korea and how they're playing out with respect to, for example, with the war in Ukraine and recent Russia developments, right, to support troops and all these things, I think shape well, okay, so let me put it this way. On the one hand, North Korea has been silent until recently, actually. Kim Jong-un actually came out on KCNA and announced, yes, we condemn Yoon's martial law. Okay.
Wow, interesting.
The propaganda may continue, right? He doesn't lose anything from that. But on the other hand, he's keeping his eyes on the US and President-elect Trump, right?
Yes.
So unless there's something changes on kind of the broader geopolitical situation, I don't expect anything to change drastically on that front.
Fascinating. So where does this lead to? What is your prediction if you can?
Oh gosh, good question. Um, I think that, as you probably know, the opposition has said that they are going to continue to motion to impeach weekly. So there's one planned for this Saturday. Um, uh, I think there's some confirmation in the media as well that they have as many as 5 to 6 confirmed defected votes from the ruling party. They did not
Right.
have that. They only had 3 and they never got to count because it was a boycott. But this time there seems to be, as the public outcry gets louder and louder and public opinion becomes more and more salient for the politicians, right? They're thinking in their mind, what is the best strategic situation for me, including the division within the PPP. So
Yeah,
I think,
even his own party has been calling to strip his party affiliation, right?
yes, but that's not constitutionally okay. So I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but the legal scholars say that's not, they can't legally do that. I mean, in practice, we haven't seen President Yoon very much, except this recent announcement again. But,
Yeah.
he's accepting resignation and so on. But I think that in practice, in fact, the coordination between the PPP and the prime minister, acting prime minister who will be acting president if this happens, will maybe in practice be making the day-to-day. But that's just it. I think the public, Koreans are very wondering who is making the day-to-day election call.
Yeah, right
Today,
now, who is in charge?
exactly. So I think going forward, they need the votes, the 2/3 in the National Assembly to, in fact, pass this motion. And then it's up to, if they get that, then it's up to the Constitutional Court to hand down the.
Mm,
And so I think we'll take it day by day as things develop.
yeah. Do you
But
think he'll step down in the end?
it does.
Or he would be impeached? I mean, I guess.
Well, based on this recent announcement of his, justifying and sort of reaffirming his decree, I think the resignation part, unless it's forced, is
Hmm.
unlikely. I
Yeah.
think the other calculus that both the party, including the division and so on, Han Dong-un, who's the party leader in the PPP, has come out and said that now he's going to sort of like support the impeachment. We'll see. But I think the other part of this is the party is probably calculating that, with only 6 justices sitting in the Constitutional Court, there's 3 seats that are vacant.
Uh,
They're just take the risk. What are the chances that all of them will vote,
mm,
uphold?
mm.
So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how it develops and plays out.
Well, it seems that democratic governments are facing lots of challenges these days. We see that from France to South Korea, and obviously in the United States as well. So, what is the trend that you're observing?
Thank you for asking that question because certainly, even though this is really important question for South Korea, I think what are the lessons we can learn from what's
Yes.
happening in Korea? And I think absolutely what we've seen is democratic backsliding, right?
Yeah.
The level of democracy enjoyed by the average person in the world in 2023 is down to the 1985 levels. Um, and by country-based averages, it's back to 1998. Okay, so
Mm,
we have, more of the world's population living in autocratizing countries, right, than in democratizing. So of course, people are going to, and experts have said that institutions alone are not sufficient.
mm.
So, as we've seen, even in developed, industrialized countries in Europe and even the US, there's always that threat of a stable, seemingly stable,
Mm.
and sort of checks and balances, right? Different actors and factors and interests can bend those, right? Those checks and balances, including with the media, media being neutral and so on.
Yeah.
the so-called informal guardrails, right? The sort of democratic norms of mutual tolerance and forbearance, right? To safeguard, like it's in your interest if you're the ruling party to safeguard the opposition's needs and to try to work with them and all the other parties that represent people to govern, right? To deliver on that mandate. So I think we can say that even for the countries that we're seen as stable, consolidated democracies, that, certain, indices or whatever have called to attention that they're backsliding. We have to sort of look at what's happening on the ground as well. What's happening in between elections and who's in charge day to day, right? In order to determine, yes, we may have free and fair elections. They're doing really well, including in South Korea, right? Not much violence, turnover of whoever the winner is, right? But I think this recent event and crisis is telling us something unique about South Korean partisan polarization and politics because of its own unique history. But on the other hand, it kind of fits, I think, with all the other kind of similar factors around the world. So you see, like, for example, right, what's happening in Germany and France and other places in Latin America, the sort of rise of populism, whether right wing or left wing, right?
What would you attribute to? What's the common theme that's happening that's causing all
Yeah.
these, supposed to be like mature democracies to behave this way?
So, from a very big picture standpoint, I think a lot of the sort of the usual things, because the world is so much more connected, right? Especially since the 1990s with globalization and kind of, economy connections and so on. It's become much more complicated, right? So a lot of the things that are attributed to the underlying causes are things like economic grievances by sort of the left behind communities that the political elites, whichever party is in control, they are not responsive to the needs of the everyday citizens, right?
In America too. Yeah.
America too, and actually, I think the sort of constant and more frequent outbreak of civil unrest, civil wars, war in Ukraine, right? Gods of the Middle East, are also have now become, I think, since the onset or escalation of war, especially in Ukraine, have sort of become the sort of cleavage, division between parties and what they sort of support and run on in places like Germany and others. And so, and then the other one is, I think, migration. And that is also driven by lots of things like the global climate, right, issue and people not being able to live where they used to live. And so these are the common threads, I
Yeah.
think. A lot of pressure on governments and governance. And so if they don't have that kind of bottom up participation from the civil society, and in South Korea, of course, they have a very, very progressive, very organized civil society and network that I think is amazing that they were able to sort of show up, and be in between the police and the military and the National Assembly so quickly. Previous martial laws have lasted much longer, hundreds of days, but this one was like what, 2.5 hours or
2
something.
day. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah.
So I think that it's telling of how important the kind of the role of, the electorate, the citizens, the bottom up kind of, engagement, if you will, of democracies, especially in nascent democracies, right?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, I wouldn't call South Korea a nascent democracy. I mean,
No.
it does feel like the democracy is treaty still has a strong hold. That's why it's able to, basically revert the martial law in such a short time. And we continue to see so much just public, sort of sharing or, their complaints or their dissatisfaction with the president's decisions. So at least I would say that's something, that's welcomed, and very pleased to see that still happening in South Korea. So with that, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us your own thoughts for what is happening right now. Obviously, this is still happening, and we don't know how much longer it'll continue and what the outcomes might be. But of course, we wish the best to the people in South Korea, and of course, hope that democracy can be upheld. So thank you, Jiang, for joining us. Take
Thank you
care.
very much for having me. Take care.